Well, hello everybody, and we're going to turn our attention in this lecture now to the great Socrates. We looked in the last lecture at those who were called the pre-Socratic philosophers, called such because they were before Socrates, and that indicates something of his importance. And so in this lecture, we're going to be looking at him in terms of his life and especially in terms of his thought. And we'll also do this in relationship with his great student Plato. And so we'll round out the end of this lecture with a discussion of Plato's life and some of his writings. And then that will lead us into the next talk where we'll discuss Plato's thought in relation to Aristotle. Okay, so Socrates. Socrates, a fascinating figure from the ancient world, somebody who is still with us today. In many respects, his thought has a kind of eternal quality to it. And I think that you'll enjoy learning about him. You'll see something of a man of character and of principle, somebody who was really willing to put his money where his mouth was in terms of what he believed. And so to really have an understanding of Western philosophy as a whole, to have a consideration of Socrates, the questions that he was asking and the answers he was providing will give us a really helpful trajectory as we find ourselves now in the 21st century. And I would argue that when we look around us today and we sort of see the problems in our culture, I think an antidote to those problems would actually be to a return to Socrates. Obviously, he's not going to have all of the answers that we're looking for as Christians, but in terms of a broader societal approach, you can't really go wrong with Socrates. So who was Socrates? Before we can really get into a question of his life, we want to look very briefly at how we know that he even existed. He did not leave a body of writings behind, so there's nothing that we can turn to and say, oh, this was written by Socrates. And that should not pose a problem for us, especially as Christians, because our own Savior, Jesus Christ, did not leave a body of writings behind in terms of his human ministry or his earthly ministry. And so Socrates, we don't have anything from his pen, but we do have works written about him from his own time, from people that would have known him, walked the streets of Athens with him. The first of those is from the pen of the great ancient satirist Aristophanes. And he wrote a number of satires that had Socrates involved in it, the main one being the Clouds. And this is a helpful source insofar as it tells us something of what his critics and his detractors thought of him. Now, it's a satire, so it's not going to be the most helpful in terms of getting an accurate portrayal of Socrates' life and thought. But where it corroborates other sources, it's going to be helpful. It's worth reading just because, it's funny, and so Aristophanes is funny. We'll get into him a little bit more in a minute. The second major source is a work called Apology of Socrates to the Jury, and that was written by a man named Xenophon. The problem with this source is that it was not written as a first-hand account of the trial of Socrates. So it is a description. It's worth reading. It has accuracy, but it's helpful in terms, again, like Aristophanes, where the both of them can corroborate what we know from other sources. The final one is the most important, and this is actually, there's one key source in terms of his life, his trial, and his death, which is Plato's Apology, the Apology of Socrates, written in 399 BC. And this is a first-hand eyewitness account of the trial of Socrates before his Athenian jurors. And alongside this, Plato wrote about 29 other dialogues that involve Socrates as a key figure. Some of the ones that you might not be familiar with are Crito and Euthyphro, or Gorgias, or Meno, or Parmenides. Others you probably would be familiar with, particularly the Republic or the Symposium. And Plato is really important, as we will see later when we talk about him in some detail, because he was a student of Socrates. He knew him relatively early on and spent a lot of time with him and was there for the trial. and was responsible for carrying on Socrates' legacy into the ancient world. The problem, though, with Plato is that it's almost the opposite of Aristophanes. Whereas Aristophanes is highly critical, Plato, on the other hand, is got a very high view of Socrates, such that we really don't get much of a critical view of him. We don't see him warts and all, as it were. And so, in reality, there are kind of like two Socrateses in history. There's the Socrates of history, the one that you would have known, if you walked into your local Starbucks, and there he is, probably ordering a latte, and that one, who put his pants on one leg at a time, that sort of Socrates. And that's the one we really don't know a whole lot about. And then we have the Socrates who is the figure given to us by Plato. And as helpful as this is, it doesn't really penetrate into the man himself, which is a shame because he is such an important figure, such a fascinating figure. It would really be great to have a kind of biography of him, as it were. But there are certain things we do know of his life that we've culled together from sources. We know obviously that he had a mother and a father, as everybody does. And we know a little bit about them. His dad was a stonemason. His name was Sophroniscus. And there's some indication, I think, that Socrates had a decent or good relationship with his dad. We think this because he named his firstborn son after his dad. Socrates' mother was a woman named Phaneretta, and she was a midwife. And there's also indication from Socrates that he had a good relationship with his mom. And we say this because Socrates described his own vocation as a kind of wandering teacher and philosopher. He described it as being a midwife. He saw himself as sort of giving birth to truth. And so this is something that he would have picked up from his mom. And obviously, if he didn't like his mother, I don't think he would take on that kind of image for his own self. Socrates was married. He was married to a woman who was 40 years his junior, a woman named Xanthippe. And they had 3 children, as I indicated, the firstborn named after Socrates' dad, Sophroniscus, as well as Lamprocles and Menexenus. Socrates lived in Athens. He was born, raised, and lived his life in Athens during a time that we would describe as a kind of Gilded Age in Athenian society. So if I use the term Gilded Age, I'm thinking here of a society that has kind of gotten bloated and fat, that is materialistic, has more money than it knows what to do with, and yet at the same time has kind of got a sense of purposelessness to it, meaninglessness. And so this dominates in Athenian society. And when Socrates is kind of being raised up amidst it, he has serious problems with what it's doing to civic life. Pericles had levied a heavy tax on Athens, on the people, and this then precipitates the Peloponnesian War. If you ever want to get into the Peloponnesian War, I'd highly recommend the work of a man named Victor Davis Hanson, a war like no other that gets into this. It's fascinating. And so this war begins in 431, ends in 404, where the mighty Spartan army comes and defeats the Athenians finally. And so all of this has a very negative effect on society. Everything from education and law and public works, all these things become politicized, put into the hands of the powers that be. And this led to a kind of lackluster public thought and lackluster civic virtue, both of which Socrates is going to hit head on. When you think of Athens at this time, it's not entirely unlike our own day. We live in a kind of Gilded Age. You read the works of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and you can almost put modern faces to it. And we live in a bloated Western world, especially in North America, and we have lost our sense of meaning. And a lot of our public intellectuals are not helping us. This was a time of war in Athens. In fact, Socrates served in the military, and we've been dealing with global conflicts in our own day, where our forces, whether America or my own country, Canada, have been overseas fighting. And there's a group in our day of public intellectuals who are not helping us think through these matters in a clear way. And such was the case in Athens. There were a group, we could kind of call them philosophers. We could think of them as more likely a public intellectual type, called the sophists. And these were sort of Socrates' great nemesis. Thinkers that had the ear of society, that were leading it in terms of its thought life in a not so great direction. You've heard the word sophistry before. So somebody who is described today as a sophist it's not a good term. Somebody who speaks flowery language with no meaning and no value behind it. And many of our intellectuals are like this, I think, today. While the sophists in Socrates' day, they valued rhetoric, but their philosophy behind it was damaging. They were largely skeptical, many of them radical skeptics. So the idea of skepticism here means that you really can't have a knowledge of the world. You can't have truth. Most would view that, language is absurd. The three most famous of the skeptics were Gorgias, Protagoras, and Thrasymachus. And they all embodied these views. Gorgias was a radical skeptic, and he favors rhetoric over philosophy. And so all of the thinking that had gone on from Thales down to Parmenides was all useless, according to him. He denied truth, saying that all statements are false. Now think about that for a second. All statements are false. If all are false, that includes the statement, all statements are false. That means his own statement is false. But if it's false, then it could be true. It's what you call a paradox, a kind of liar's paradox. And so, we might think, oh, what a fool that he would make such an obvious blunder in his thinking and writing. But that's the whole point. Everything is absurd, and even a statement like that is absurd as anything else. He didn't believe anything existed, including God, and so here you have a kind of atheism. And so it's such a backdrop that Socrates comes on to the scene, and he was quite concerned at the direction that society was taking in terms of all of these background issues, militarily, politically, and intellectually. He was concerned that this loss of truth would lead to a loss of virtue, and both in terms of personal virtues, but also as that then permeates in the society. He was very, very deeply concerned about the loss of civic virtue, and thought that this would then spell the death of society. And so this then becomes the impetus behind why he would go out and teach in the highways and byways of Athens in order to sort of shake society up, in order to steer it onto a more proper course. So he's concerned then about this connection between truth, knowledge, and virtue. And that's a hallmark of his thought, really. He believed that knowledge and virtue were intimately connected, and that virtue could even be defined as a kind of right knowledge. That what happens here is going to come out your fingertips. And I think this is an important concept for us to grasp today as well, especially when many in our society want to give politicians a pass for moral conduct, as though what they did in their private lives didn't have an effect in their public life. And if you think immorally, and you will act immorally, and that's not just going to be a private matter, but it's going to be of public concern. And so what Socrates wants to do is he wants to get at truth, and he wants to help people understand how to get at truth. And so he has this whole approach that we today call the Socratic method, based on questioning, where he would take a very important issue, usually an issue pertaining to virtue, so something like fortitude or courage, what is the nature of love, what is justice, what is the good, and he would walk around and walk up to somebody in that proverbial Starbucks, and as he's getting his latte, turn to the guy next to him, who might be some sort of leader, maybe a politician, a military leader, maybe a sophist, and he would say to them, "What is justice?" And his interlocutor would respond with a woefully inadequate answer. And so then, using questions, Socrates would penetrate into that answer, asking more questions, leading them to the point where their ignorance of these matters would be shown up. And often there were a lot of people watching. And so he would ask these provocative questions, constantly pushing back at assumptions and always seeking definitions of things. So if he wants to get at justice, he's going to want to seek out a definition of justice that is entirely adequate right off the bat. And so as he did this, and as it kind of caught on, and crowds were following him, typically young people were following him around as his students, and as these various leaders were being shown up in terms of their ignorance, Athenian society did not like this. And so what he was trying to do with this method was determine the essence and logic of things, to probe at universal truths. And so here he actually believes in such things as a universal truth. He's not a relativist, that there's an objective truth in regard to all matters, even the ones that seem entirely subjective to us, like beauty, that there are universal principles behind these things that we can know and we should know, and then we should live in accordance with. The Socratic method really kind of has two parts to it. One is entirely directed towards the self, and then the other is moved outwards in terms of the community. So the first part of it we could describe as kind of negative. What Socrates realized was that if he really wants to get at these universal principles, he needs to do so first in terms of his own self. He needs to understand and then live justly. He needs to understand what true love is and be a loving person. He needs to understand piety and then be pious. And so what he did was he kind of embarked upon a rugged exploration of the self, where he had to kind of really evaluate himself, be objective. What traditions did he hold to that he was holding merely for the purpose of tradition, not because there was anything necessarily true about them? What prejudices did he harbor in his heart that he needed to cleanse himself of? What areas was he ignorant about that he needed to go and learn? And so I think this is remarkable. I think it's very helpful for all of us to kind of get a sense of. I think this is a kind of noble approach to the self, where we want to be honest with ourselves. We want to be honest when we know we're speaking untruthfully about something or about ourselves, and to be able to master ourselves in such a way that we are truthful people. One person I think actually is quite helpful with this in this regard is a Canadian psychologist named Jordan Peterson. And his book, 12 Rules for Life, I think really gets at something of what Socrates was trying to do. And more importantly, this teaching, this kind of negative approach of helping oneself get at these universal principles, I think is best exemplified in the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus, of course, was a wandering teacher like Socrates. Jesus, of course, had a group of disciples or students around him, and he taught moral principles. Obviously, the gospel is more than just a moral principle. It's about how one is made right with God through Christ and his death and resurrection. But nevertheless, Jesus was a moral teacher, and he saw the problems of society, whether it was the Roman Empire of the time, whether it was the Jewish nation, the Jewish state. And so he would walk around and he would challenge the people of his day to be self-evaluating and to purge oneself of sin, of sinful behavior through confession of sin and repentance in order to live rightly in God's kingdom. So again, some interesting parallels, not equal parallels. Of course, Jesus is God and Jesus is alive. Socrates was not God and Socrates is dead. But nevertheless, there are some correspondences. The second aspect of the Socratic method is positive. And by this I mean it's outward looking. Now that you are striving to live this kind of more just, more loving, more virtuous, more pious life, now you have some grounds to be able to go out into your community, into society, as it were, here into Athens, and then to be able to bring this knowledge of the self, knowledge of universal principles into the community. And here we see that acquiring knowledge is really for Socrates a communal exercise, that it's done in dialogue or conversation. And here again, Socrates is remarkably helpful. He does not go out and just batter people upside the head with his views. Now, he could be very pointed and very devastating in his critiques, but really what he wanted to do was engage in dialogue. He was not just somebody up on a soapbox making moral pronouncements, but he wanted to get people to think by asking them questions. And so here, this method, very much an informal method. Like I said, you could do it in Starbucks, and heavily conversation-based, where you have to ask questions. And I think two of the greatest principles of good conversation is the ability to ask questions and the ability to listen. And I think here Socrates is giving us something of a way forward to be much more conversational. There's a great one of the great exemplars of Socrates' whole approach is found in Plato's Meno dialogue, Meno, and it's a fascinating dialogue where and we'll look at it in more detail in a minute, where Socrates gets involved in a discussion about the universal principles of mathematics and whether they can be known and accessed by all. And so the illustration is actually done with a slave boy who has no education, who demonstrates mathematical knowledge. And this then proves that some ideas are innate and exist in the very soul. And so when you read this dialogue, you see the Socratic method par excellence. So against the sophists, Socrates believed that there was a difference between objective truth and falsehood, between that which is good and that which was bad. And he argued that bad actions corrupt the soul, and if you think wrongly, you're going to behave wrongly. And he was not at all concerned about the opinions of the majority. We see this in his trial and in his execution. He doesn't care about what the crowd thinks. In this sense, he's kind of like the ultimate punk rocker. And he did not, care if a group in the room said one thing and that one thing was not true. He sided with truth. It was the opinion of the wise that mattered to him, and those who were guided by reason in the search of truth. So in terms of his trial and his death, the city-state of Athens did not like Socrates. They didn't like that he went about asking all these questions that, were showing them up to be a bunch of ignoramuses. They didn't know how to answer these questions, and they didn't like that the crowd knew this. And he acquired, of course, numerous enemies and naysayers who came together to put him on trial. Hold on. So we've seen one such naysayer in Aristophanes and his satire of the clouds. He wrote others where Socrates makes an appearance, like the play Frogs and the other one Birds. And so Aristophanes contributed to a very negative view of Socrates in terms of the public. There's nothing new under the sun. He's like a modern version of a Saturday Night Live or a Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert. The power of satire is quite remarkable. You can really sway public opinion just by making fun of somebody in a really effective way. And I think this is the role that stand-up comedy actually has in our society as well. And so Aristophanes accused Socrates as, all of his questions that he was asking is basically just kind of hair-splitting twaddle. I think it's such a great term, twaddle. We get a lot of that in our culture today too. I'm father of 4 kids. We're not really big into watching television, but when they do get a chance to watch it, some of the stuff that they put on is just absolutely vacuous. And I'm thinking, man, I actually feel like I can hear their brain cells exploding as they're watching some of these stupid things on TV. It's twaddle. And so he thinks that Socrates is just splitting hairs with all these silly questions. In the year 399, after democracy is restored to Athens, the desire to put Socrates on trial then gets put into action. So he is accused by 3 men, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, of 2 things. These are the major charges that are brought against him. The first is corrupting the youth. And so, it was the younger people that were following him, that were taking him seriously, that were saying, yeah, our society is really messed up, and this guy seems to have a way forward. Let's follow him. And so the Athenians did not like this, and so they were accusing him of then corrupting the youth. And the second one was the charge of impiety. Now, what they're not saying was that he was some sort of immoral man, that there was something in his closet that they had discovered and put on full display. It seems like he was the kind of guy you couldn't do that to. He was rather virtuous. Rather, by impiety, what's specifically mentioned here is the idea of his denial of the gods of Athens. So, as we saw with the pre-Socratics, philosophy, it really has its birth in its turn away from the Homeric myths of the Iliad or the Odyssey, and so the philosophers were kind of deemed as sort of a group of atheists, even if they actually did believe in some sort of higher being out there, God, the good, or whatever. But because they were not following along with the mythologies, they were deemed to be atheistic. Now, of course, these myths were really helpful in terms of controlling the populace, controlling the ideas of the society. And so one of the reasons that people like Socrates were throwing off these mythologies was in order to get at truth, which oftentimes meant having to have a kind of a break politically. And this is probably even more behind what's going on. He was friends with a group of anti-democratic politicians, and this is the rise of Athenian democracy. So a number of anti-democratic politicians were actually purged from government, and Socrates was friends with them. And so this was also kind of behind what was going on. So the charge of impiety was really actually a political charge. And so therefore he gets put on trial. The record of the trial is given to us by Plato, as we saw with the Apology, but also in his other dialogues like Euthyphro, Crito, and Phaedo. And as we also saw, Xenophon provides an account of the trial in his own Apology. So massive jury, some 500 members of Athenian society were in the jury. And I love Socrates' defense. He does not give one whit what these people think about him. And he knows he's going to die anyway, and so he just goes full charge against them. His basic defense was that he was divinely called to lead others to the improvement of their souls. And this is what you are putting me on trial for. I'm just trying to help people as they improve their souls, as they try to live a better life. And here you are wanting to kill me for it. In the various Platonic dialogues, Socrates basically excoriates his accusers and his jurors for their inability to think. He just goes at them hammer and tong. And much of it is actually quite witty and hilarious. So we get some wit with Aristophanes' satire, but Socrates can give it back just as good as he gets. And throughout the accounts of his trial, there's a kind of tacit awareness on Socrates' part of his impending death. He says, no man on earth flatly prevents a great many wrongs and illegalities from taking place. No man on earth who conscientiously opposes either you or any other organized democracy and flatly presents a great many wrongs and illegalities from taking place in the state to which he belongs can possibly escape with his life. So he knows. I'm critiquing you even now in the midst of this trial, and you will kill me for it. So angered by his obstinacy, the jury, of course, finds Socrates guilty of the charges, and his punishment is execution. And it's a pretty heinous way of executing somebody. And what they actually do is they force him to kill himself. He's forced to drink hemlock, and then that poison then would kill him. And so Socrates then becomes his own executioner, and his death comes around his 70th birthday. Though it was Socrates who was on trial in Athens, really it's been the Athenians and those in history like them who have been judged by the bar of history. Socrates is aware of this and says as much. When I leave this court, I shall go away condemned by you to death. But they will go away convicted by truth herself of depravity and wickedness, and they accept their sentence, even as I accept mine. Speaking of the kind of people who would execute a Socrates in our day, the philosopher Edward Feser wryly comments, Today, they'd probably just denounce him as a neocon or part of the religious right and haul him off for multicultural sensitivity training. Probably right, Mr. Phaser. Well, that's something of Socrates in terms of his life and what we know of him. I want to turn now to Plato, because Plato is going to help shed some light on these matters as well. And so we'll look at Plato right now in terms of just his basic life story, and then his writings, before we'll then, in the next lecture, get into his thought. So Socrates does not found a particular school. He's what we would call a peripatetic teacher. By this, we're thinking here of a wandering teacher, somebody who wandered about Athens teaching whoever would listen. And so he would have students following around, learning from his various questionings of the people around him. And the most famous of these students, of course, was Plato. Plato was born in Athens around 427 BC and died at the age of 80. Plato was actually a nickname for him. It was his given name was Aristocles, and so he grew up in a family of some means. His father was of the aristocracy in Athens, and he was said to have descended from earlier Athenian kings. So because he came from such a background, he received a good education. He had educational contact, actually, with some of the followers of Heraclitus. So you remember Heraclitus, he was the pre-Socratic philosopher from Ephesus who said that the arche, or all of reality, was made up of that kind of weird fire. And so from the followers of Heraclitus, Plato picks up his notions that all of life is in a state of change or motion. He was said to have been an attractive and rugged sort of looking guy. He, like his teacher, served in the military. He fought against the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War. Pretty remarkable. It was after his military service, while he was in his 20s, that he first came to follow Socrates, though there is some evidence that they would have known each other before he went into the army. Before meeting Socrates, Plato was deeply interested in poetry and poetics, and that's I'm glad for that, because it really impacts his literary style. If you read any of Plato's dialogues, they're noteworthy as works of literature, and you can see how the influence of poetry really shaped him as a writer. Some of his family served in the Athenian government during the tyranny of 403-404, known as the oligarchy. They had urged Plato to go into politics, but when their policies had turned to violence, he became disgusted with this, and he left politics altogether. He, like Socrates, did not like the democracy, and so, especially after Socrates' death, he really didn't like them, because it was them that they had put him on trial and executed him. As we know from his dialogues, Plato was present at the trial of Socrates, and he actually even offered to stand in Socrates' place as a kind of surety for his teacher, something that was flatly rejected by Socrates. Socrates was not going to have somebody stand in his place. When it was time for Socrates to drink the hemlock, though a number of his pupils were in the room, Plato was noticeably absent due to an illness. And it's said that after Socrates died, Plato actually escaped from Athens and went into a kind of exile with the philosopher Euclid in a place called Megara. Early biographers also record him traveling to places like Cyrene, to Italy, and even to Egypt. And it's hard exactly to accurately trace his travels. We know that in the 40s he does go to Italy and to Sicily. There's a story that he was invited into the courts of a tyrant named Dionysius II, and was teaching him various aspects of Socrates' thought. Upon his return to Athens around 389-388, he founded a school called the Academy. So he does not follow Socrates in terms of being a wandering teacher, but rather he establishes an institution, Plato's Academy, named after a hero named Academus, who was buried nearby. As the great historian of philosophy, Father Copplestone, says, we can point to Plato's Academy as the first European university, as the school focused not just on philosophy, but mathematics, astronomy, and others of the natural sciences. So you're studying at California Baptist University, and this university has its origins way back when, with the first of such schools with Plato's Academy. And so we stand in a very long line in a noble tradition. Though Plato's main purpose was to form statesmen, and so here he is again taking up the mantle from Socrates, that if we have virtuous political leaders, we will have a virtuous society. And he wanted his students to be involved in what he would describe as a disinterested pursuit of the sciences. And that sounds like a strange term, a disinterested pursuit of the sciences. By disinterested here, we mean that he wants them to want to know for the sake of knowing, for the value of knowing. Not just knowledge to get you a certain end, like a job. I've got 4 advanced degrees that the final one was a PhD, and really I did that because I needed a job. But I also want to be a disinterested learner. I want to have a love of learning that's not just going to get me some material end. And so he calls it a disinterested pursuit of the sciences. And sciences here means any object of knowledge, scientia, knowledge. And so that will include the natural sciences, but it'll include things beyond that as well. And so he sees the value of politicians, of statesmen, of rulers, being pursuers, disinterested pursuers of knowledge, because that will have a greater effect in the society. Plato lectures at the Academy and runs it administratively. Copplestone makes an important observation about Plato's lectures when we compare them with Aristotle. With Aristotle, as we'll see, all we have of his writings are his lecture notes, and they're rather dry. And so we sometimes compare Aristotle to Plato in terms of their style and say, Aristotle is much more dense and hard to deal with. Plato is beautiful and easy to read. It's a bit unfair because the distinction is probably not so strong. We don't have copies of Plato's lectures. And so we cannot say for certain that they would have been any different than Aristotle's when Aristotle would go and teach in his own school. And we know Aristotle wrote dialogues, we just don't have any. So to make that kind of comparison is a bit difficult. Aristotle himself would say that when people came to hear Plato lecture on something like the good, they would be surprised to hear him speaking in terms of mathematics and astronomy. So there you go. So there's a time he had been invited to teach, to go and instruct another tyrant in geometry, Dionysius II in Syracuse. And as he gets there, he has some difficulties with this leader, so he returns to Athens, continues to teach Dionysius by letter, by correspondence. So the first online program, as it were, was Plato teaching Dionysius II by way of letter. And so what we're doing here is not altogether unlike it. The technology is a bit more advanced, but the concept is still the same. This, though, was insufficient, and Dionysius wanted face-to-face studies with his teacher, so he summoned Plato back to Syracuse in 361, where he remains for a year. And then he comes home to Athens, and then he stays teaching at the Academy until his death in the year around 348, 347 BC. Plato has long been considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, philosopher who's ever lived. There's a famous statement by a man named Alfred North Whitehead. Whitehead himself, a very important 20th century philosopher and mathematician. And he said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. While that may be something of an exaggeration on Whitehead's part, nonetheless, he's getting at something, that we all really do stand downstream from a thinker like Plato. So I just want to turn now quickly to a consideration of Plato's body of written work. When you consider that we don't have much by way of a written record by the pre-Socratics, right? We've only got some fragments, some aphorisms from Heraclitus and some other singular writings. Thales we have nothing by. It's pretty remarkable then that we have as much from Plato's pen as we do in terms of, here's an ancient thinker. We've actually got quite a lot of his writings. Paradoxically, we know less about Plato's life than we do about Socrates, which is kind of funny. And so we have 35 of Plato's writings that are known to us, and so the Platonist opera, or the works of Plato, are published by Oxford University Press, and they run to 5 volumes. His writings come, as I've indicated already, in the form or the genre of the dialogue, which was unique in the history of philosophy up until this point. So when we come to the end of the pre-Socratic era, the Greeks had become quite bored with the style of writing that had become common for the philosophers. And philosophers were becoming a source of scorn. So Socrates wasn't the only one to get made fun of. And these were these ones that had their heads in the clouds. And so it takes someone like Plato to effectively rescue philosophy. And how does he rescue philosophy? With literature. And how does he do this? Well, what he does is he makes philosophy interesting, and he makes it practical by putting it into story form with dialogue. Everybody loves a good story. And so the dialogues are stories of people who are together wrestling through these great philosophical concepts, right? The key figure, the key person in these narratives is Socrates himself. Other characters appear. These will be named. Some will be named from other philosophers. We actually have dialogues like Parmenides. You met Parmenides already in the last lecture. He's the last of the pre-Socratics, the guy who argued that everything was static being, and so Socrates has a dialogue with him. And so what Plato's trying to do is put feet on the ground, so that you feel like you're engaged personally in the story. And as such, then you become engaged with these deep philosophical questions. And so his dialogical style is immensely practical. They represent real-world people trying to figure out the meaning of life. So Socrates, he goes around teaching. He's the object of scorn. He gets made fun of in plays like those by Aristophanes and in the attacks of the sophists. As John Mark Reynolds says in his outstanding book, When Jerusalem Met Athens, Socrates was rescued from oblivion by a better storyteller, and that was Plato. Plato recognized that philosophy was to be concerned not only with the good and the true, but also the beautiful, and that beauty was expressed in stories that were compelling and livable. And then he sets a standard then that has been followed to greater or lesser effect all the way down through the centuries. The idea of teaching philosophy through story is common. Think about Dante, the Inferno and the comedy, Purgatorio, right? Those are great stories, very philosophically oriented. Think of Shakespeare. You don't want to divorce Shakespeare from philosophy. Even in the 20th century, right? We'll look at the existentialists. Jean-Paul Sartre, much of his philosophy came by way of story. Albert Camus, my favorite, wrote stories that were very philosophical. One of the greatest philosophical novelists of the late modern period was a woman named Iris Murdoch. Read her works, deeply philosophical. Interestingly, as much as Plato's worldview is different than Homer's, he nonetheless used mythology in his writings. And so, for instance, Plato was the one who first concocted the idea of the lost city of Atlantis. His dialogues are meant to invite us in as listeners. It's as if you're sitting at that dinner party in the symposium where Socrates is waxing eloquent at your table. And, somebody in the back room is, retching from overindulging in food and alcohol. And, you get some really interesting conversations in something like the symposium, there's no doubt, when you're trying to figure out what is the nature of the erotic. And that's at a dinner party with some homoerotic undertones to it. And so there's an argument to be made that though Plato is not a Christian, indeed Dante puts him in hell in his own writings, nevertheless his thought pushes us towards the good, capital G, good. He wants us to know truth, and he wants us to be staggered by beauty. And so though he's no Christian, as Reynolds says, for a society that is losing its Christian bearings, Plato and Socrates makes for a good guide. And we can think of his views of the transcendent that serves as a philosophical rebuke to atheism, his notions of justice and political order are a rebuke to our modern day society where justice is just being thrown out the window. Everybody talks about justice, but we need a Socrates to really push back on what is the nature of true justice? Has a high view of the role of beauty in society, as seen in his dialogue Hippias Major, where there's an extended conversation going on between Socrates and a sophist named Hippias over the nature of beauty. And so we divide Plato's works up into three basic groups, and it's fairly straightforward and unremarkable when you think about it. Although we should note that some of the chronology is disputed by scholars, so this is a broad threefold categorization. There are the early dialogues, and so these are the ones that have Socrates as the kind of central character, the exemplary philosopher. And here you get much more of Socrates' own voice speaking through. And here he's found asking these great questions of practical importance. This is where the testimony of the death of Socrates is found, particularly in the Apology. The second group is the middle dialogues, and though Socrates is, of course, still the focal point, here we see much more Plato himself shining through, where he begins to outline his own philosophy and deals with issues that are regularly confronting humans. Two most important of the middle dialogues are the Symposium and the Republic that we'll look at. We'll look at the Republic in the next lecture. The late dialogues, these are much more detailed philosophical studies. And they give a much more elaborate metaphysical system. So when you read the late dialogues, they're very technical. Some of them, they'll just bend your mind as you're reading them. Most important of these are the laws, and then really I think most important is the Timaeus. And this is where you get into all kinds of interesting metaphysical discussions. And so the three groups are kind of thought of as, group one are the Socratic dialogues, two, the literary works, and three, the technical philosophy. And so in a sense, you can kind of track with Plato as he matures in his thought from being the student of Socrates then to becoming a philosopher in his own right. We have some of his letters, some poetry, and then there are contested dialogues. We're not entirely sure whether he wrote them or not. Let's just dive in a little bit more deeply in terms of these three groups to get a better sense of who he was as a writer and a thinker. So the early dialogues, as much as they focus on Socrates' debates with other thinkers, and they have a very argumentative character to them, they're also deeply ethical in character, looking at these questions of public justice, the life of piety. And so Socrates' big point is to show that most people in society do not know how to define these basic concepts of life, things that are most important to us. And so he's looking at trying to get at a kind of common knowledge that if you want to be introduced to Plato's writings, really then it's the early dialogues to which you should turn. Very accessible, very easy to read, often short, and very practical. You'll see a lot of like, oh, I thought about that once before. Oh, it's interesting the way Socrates phrases these things. And so you can get through them in a sitting, and then you would really benefit from them. So if you're like, how do I get into classical philosophy? Turn to Plato's early dialogues. You'd be entertained as well as informed. They help us think through these questions and how to define what is virtue, what is justice, what is the good life. And the Apology is that defense that Socrates gives of his actions and thinking before this vastly arrayed set of accusers. and his wit and his biting sarcasm is great to read. The Euthyphro turns to questions of piety. It's a discussion between Socrates and a young man named Euthyphro outside of the court before Socrates' trial. If you recall, he is charged with, denying the gods of Athens, impiety, as well as corrupting the youth. Here he is with a young person, and he's talking in terms of what is piety. So he's addressing these two issues he's being charged with are now being addressed in this dialogue. And so we think of piety in terms of Christian piety, and there we're thinking of spirituality. The word piety in Socrates' day has a broader meaning, which has the idea of duty and conduct. And so, there is a sense where Socrates is guilty of impiety because he's leading these young people to question the authority of the Athenian leaders. That will disrupt society. But is that an impiety that's going to lead to a greater piety? The middle dialogues differ, as I've said, in a number of ways from the early, in main because of the place of Socrates' thought, but also because they tend to be a bit longer. These are marked by high literary quality, showing that Plato believed that the beautiful beautiful thought should be expressed beautifully. And in these dialogues, we start to see rudimentary expressions of Plato's notion of the forms that we'll look at in the next lecture. And in works like the Symposium, one of the most important of the middle dialogues, we get really interesting discussions on the nature of the erotic or love. It's a dinner party. Socrates is the main guest. The members, including Aristophanes, he shows up, hate Socrates, and they get into a nature of what is love. And here love is erotic love, love that is directed to a greater end, namely in the good, and not love for love's sake, but love for a higher purpose. And Socrates argues that erotic love should move from being directed towards things in the physical world towards a love for beauty itself. And the end of the dialogue, you get this really weird scene where you get this character named Alcibiades showing up, bursts in drunk out of his gourd, and proceeds to pour out a kind of like weird homoerotic speech about how wonderful Socrates is. I mean, it makes for some eye-opening reading. The very important middle dialogue then is the Republic, where Plato and Socrates set out their vision for an ideal city-state. We'll look at that in terms of the cave, Plato's cave, in the next lecture. And then the final set of dialogues, these late dialogues, they've got this strangeness to them when you read them. The Timaeus describes the creation of the world. What is the physical world that we live in? The nature of the universe? What is it that makes us human? Many early Christians actually adopt aspects of the Timaeus in their theology, and because largely it was one of the only the dialogues by Plato available in the early church. Yet this view this dialogue has a view of this weird, subordinate, godlike figure who creates everything, namely the demiurge. If the material world is bad, the pure, the good could not have brought it into being, and so there's this demiurge, this lower level god that's the creator, and so that actually forms a backdrop to the rise of early Gnostic thinking in the early church that the Christians had to combat. So hopefully this has been something of an enlightening survey of Socrates and Plato's life and writings, and kind of sets us up well now for our discussion of Plato's thought in the next lecture. There we're going to get into his idea of the forms, the ideal world, and his political views in relation to the Republic. We won't get into that as much. Plato is incredibly important. He's well worth reading. I think to get at a healthy Christian theology and philosophy, we actually need to recapture some of the way that the early Christians were influenced by Plato. And so if you want to think through issues of justice, of love, of courage, piety, he'd be a great place to start. And a systematic reading of his dialogues, I think, would pay great dividends in your life. So I'm just going to conclude now with the words of John Mark Reynolds again, where he describes the nature of Plato's works. He says, if Plato wrote it, then it still exists, which is a rare thing for an ancient author. The young Plato mourned the death of Socrates and the Apology. The aging and dying Plato lost any vision of his old master in the laws. In between is seen the growth of a great mind that reaches its full power in the masterful republic. So with that, I conclude. We'll pick up in the next lecture.